In any case, thank you. Where's Caitlin? Caitlin, thank you so much. That was really great. Just observing that, doing that art making was a way of connecting us that just a regular conversation wouldn't have had that same kind of I think for me, it was because as I was drawing, I realized that my partner was seeing a great vulnerability of mine and so accepted me anyway. So, I thank you, Nita. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. In any case, that was really, really an addition to our day. So now we are going to head into our next session, presentation by Pablo Tinio. He is an associate professor and chair of the Educational Foundations Department at Montclair State University, where he also directs the Creativity and Aesthetics Lab. And he will be speaking to us on the topic of search for meaning and understanding in the museum, a multiple methods approach. Pablo.
Good news is I've been promoted since that.
Oh, so what do you now? Okay,
Cool.
excellent.
At this point, not that it matters to you.
Now you really need to listen to the talk, because it's really legit.
Yeah, congrats. Well, I just want to first thank you for inviting me to speak here. I'm going to break one big rule today, which is I always tell my students, don't put too many words or too much stuff on your slides. I'm going to put a crap load of stuff. I have a lot of stuff on my slides today, and it's a lot of text, but it is really to honor the voice of the participants in the studies that I'm going to talk about. So my background is in psychology of art and aesthetics, aka empirical aesthetics, and it's not about just art, right? Even though we do, that is probably, visual arts is probably the most studied in my field. We do architecture, music, obviously, faces, right? So I've done research on the perception of human faces. But it is the most studied set of stimuli, the idea of visual arts. And we've been doing studies on visual arts for over 100 years. Right, it's like the second oldest field in psychology after psychophysics. But initially, the same person doing both at the time is it's the same guy, who transitioned us into psychology of art and aesthetics. And what we've done over the years, again, really a century, right, is look at some of basic visual features of artworks, like symmetry, complexity, curvature, differences between representational and abstract art. That's been the focus generally over those many decades. And we've learned a lot from those studies. And we've also looked at responses to art, like liking, preferences, interests, beauty, attractiveness. So my colleagues, Paul and Catherine, have done a ton of work in those areas, but also outside of these kind of things. Do you like an artwork? Do you like this painting? Do you like this sculpture? So the talk today will focus on research that we've been doing beyond those sort of basic responses, right? I hate to use the word basic, but in my field, it's kind of like basic because you ask them, do you like it or you do not like it? And it's a yes or no, right? Despite what we've done over the years, we haven't adequately or fully captured responses to art that are kind of beyond that. So things like, and I'm going to give examples later, but when you go to an art museum, the first thing that comes to mind is not always beautiful, not beautiful. I like it, I don't like it, right? That is symmetrical, asymmetrical, right? That doesn't make sense. It's I've never done asymmetrical or symmetrical. So an example for me, a personal example, these are my parents, right? My dad passed in 2013. Before that happened, I took the first visit to the major art museum was like this, standing in front of these rock posts at the Metropolitan Museum. My dad worked in construction and building his whole life. My mom was an elementary school teacher. Art was not a thing in our house. It was not a thing. Nobody ever, I don't remember, and I really thought of this over the years. I don't remember my mom or my dad ever saying the word art. All right, so that wasn't a thing in my house. So I took them to this art museum to show them what I do for a living. Right, I study art, perception, aesthetics. I study creativity and how they relate together. Those two sides, right? Aesthetics and creativity. I'm pretty sure my dad kind of passed away getting a sense of what I did, and my mom still doesn't understand. what I do. So this moment though illustrates for me like this idea of what people get out of that experience of looking at art. I couldn't just ask them, did you like the Metropolitan Museum? They would have said, yeah. But like, what does that mean? Like, yeah, I like it. Of course, they liked it because it was like new, it was different, it was grand, it's a grand museum, right? Lots of artworks, they have everything for everyone, right? So it doesn't capture what we've done, what we've studied over the years, a lot of these things that really represent aesthetic experience as we, maybe not as we know it, but maybe as we feel it and as we sense it, and certainly as we experience it, even if we can't verbalize it all the time. Metacognition, emotions, I mean, so many aspects of emotions, obviously, and relates to all the other things. Self-reflection, personal transformation, right? You ever walk into a museum and you walk out, you're like, wow, I feel a little bit different. Like I saw something, I felt something, I can't explain it, but there was something that happened to me the last 2 hours. Imagination, perspective taking. So all these things, I think, relate to this idea of search for meaning and understanding. We're always trying to make meaning of things. So for example, you're trying to make meaning of what I'm saying now, right? Like obviously you're in and out constantly, you're in, like you're paying attention, but you're not. At certain times you're thinking about other things, happy hour, right? All those things. But we're always trying to make sense of things. And this is what's happening during a museum visit, when we walk into a museum. So the museum itself is really important for the work that we do. So we've done a lot of studies in the laboratory. And we found out a lot of things. We found out what people like, what people don't like. We found out what features and characteristics of artworks impact viewing and how that artwork is experienced. But the museum provides a few things. One, this should say motivated visitors. But visitors, you don't just end up in a museum, right? I guess you could, right? Walk in, go in like a new country, you're like, oh, museum, wow, oh, this is a museum. That could happen, but generally not. We plan to go to a museum, right? We don't just wake up, pajamas, and like straight into a museum, probably get dressed, probably set aside a whole afternoon. So we are motivated. This is very different than studies in the lab, right? Obviously, it's like students want to participate, they're happy to do it, they get some course credits, they might get $20 Dunkin' Donuts gift certificate. But it's not the same as if you physically walk into a museum, buy your ticket, right? Plan, research what you might see, what's on exhibit, what's being exhibited at that moment, that day. Genuine artworks, right? Picture of my parents, 3 Rothkos, massive, versus a computer screen that shows 1 Rothko, and then you do a bunch of ratings. Again, I love doing that stuff. I will forever do those kinds of studies, but it doesn't capture a lot of what we want to capture, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. Dedicated viewing space, obviously, curatorial elements. Many of you know this, the amount of work that goes into setting up an exhibition, the amount of research, the amount of PhDs, right? That is to display one gallery, right? To put stuff in one gallery, create the text and so forth. How high you hang it, how close to one artwork to the other, and so forth. So with all of this, we set them up for big experiences, right? Potentially profound experiences, maybe rare, like experiences of sublime, Paul was talking about earlier. Experience of awe, combination of various emotions. So we set them up, but then how do we know what they're actually experiencing? And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So, but I'm going to walk you through what we typically experience in a museum that we don't in other contexts. So this actually is a piece at the Whitney Museum where we did a study, the study I'm going to talk about, by an artist named Baez. And it's on a platform, like a desk, and there's various photographs, and when you walk towards it, you're like, wow, there's like a bunch of pictures. And then you walk closer, okay, there's string, red string. And you walk closer, you examine what's happening in this piece. And what you see are actually red string, right? Kind of right through put right through the picture, aspects of it like the eyes, the nose, the mouth, right? And they're connected, so it looks like a web of stuff. It looks like one of those like AI generated images that keep moving, but it's not, it's just a red string. And so if you see these pictures on a computer screen, like as you're seeing it now, you kind of don't get a sense of like the feel of it, right? What the artist might have intended for you to experience at the museum. But if you see it in person, the physicality of it will take over you, because it is kind of weird. You see the eyes being, you can imagine like somebody putting a needle through or a nail through a string. Like who does that to a picture, right? Who does? I don't. It would be uncomfortable to. That's your dad, and that's her. It would be uncomfortable for me to stick a needle through a parent's eyes through pictures, because like, oh, this kind of doesn't feel right. So I'm going to come back to this artwork, because a visitor is going to talk about what they saw, right? What they felt, what they experienced regarding this artwork. So what we wanted to do is to characterize the lived experiences of visitors at the Whitney Museum for like a 6-month or so period. But we wanted to ask them about their experience of artworks that they found meaningful, right? Not like, what do you think of this that I, as a researcher, chose for you to look at and experience? No, we asked them to walk around, pick an artwork that they found meaningful, and then we wanted to know how they were experiencing it at that moment. We wanted to know the thoughts and insights as they were walking around the museum as well. That sense of encounter related to meaningful art. And certainly any like reflections, realizations. I don't know about you, but like I've been to exhibitions where I learned something about myself, how I perceive things, or I learned something about the world, like my world, like my sort of social circle, just from that piece of artwork. It's like a prime, right? Or a trigger to those kinds of thoughts and experiences. Before I talk about the study, we always work with theory. All right, with this. So we're working with 2 types of theory. So if you're doing research in a museum or any sort of cultural area, it's important to look at theories, because they help explain the findings, if nothing else, right? It helps you design a study, but theories help explain findings that are kind of like, wow, I don't know what that means, but theories can help us do it. The first is what we call aesthetic cognitivism. That experiences of art can enhance our understanding and our cognitive abilities. I kind of believe that, right? But obviously it's to what extent, how that happens is really difficult to answer. But I kind of believe that it has some enhancement sort of like ability, right? Enhancing ability, artworks. And we also looked at, we also used this theoretical model that I proposed in 2013. It's over 10 years now, called the mirror model of art. And essentially is that the aesthetic experience is the mirror of the art making process. But that mirror is actually, that relationship is reversed, right? So to use painting, so my colleagues here have heard this many times already. They're like, you're still talking about that theory. So guiding stuff. So I'll use painting as an example. A lot of artists, I would say most, if you disagree, that's okay. But I think most artists begin with some sort of study, right? It's not like, some do just take the canvas and go for it. And it's amazing outcome, right? But a lot do studies, right? And a lot of painters, for example, will do after the studies, little sketches, they'll do an under drawing on the canvas as a way to structure whatever other things they're gonna put on that canvas, layers, paint, and so forth. So they build onto that under drawing, right? The initial structure, they build on multiple layers of things, of materials, but they also build up conceptual layers, obviously. And throughout the art making process, there's adaptation. So they realize certain things, they might move some things, paint over certain areas with some new idea, but they come to an end, because some would argue that it's never finished, right? But at some point it is kind of finished, meaning I could show it to someone. The crazy thing is, I still think it's crazy with aesthetic research and how we perceive not only paintings, but objects in general, is that we do it the opposite of what the artist did. We begin with the surface of the painting, let's say, right? You look at symmetry, colors, complexity, and a lot of this we process automatically within milliseconds of actually looking at that painting. And the more time we spend with it, then things start happening. Like you start recognizing objects. That reminds me of something that looks like a face. I know it's a purely abstract thing, but there's a face in there somewhere and it's looking at me, right? And then the more time we spend on looking and engaging, then we start really thinking about, I wonder what the artist intended with this piece. I wonder what they were trying to communicate, right? What was the message? What were they feeling and so forth? So this is it's guiding our research, right? Because what I'll explain later is people do have the tendency to ask questions about what the artist was thinking and what they were doing the moment they created whatever piece they're creating. Lots of methods for this, right? To answer some of these questions, characterize the perceiver's lived experience. But we went to what's called a think-aloud protocol. And it's basically you stand in front of an artwork in the museum, an artwork that you find meaningful, and then you just kind of think out loud, right? We don't try to ask too many questions. If there's a pause in in your talk, then we might say something, a few words to keep it going. But typically it's like you as the participant, you as the museum visitor drive that conversation or drive the dialogue regarding that meaningful piece of art that you're standing in front of. And then we also did, so there were 2 studies that we did at the Whitney Museum of American Art. These were the exhibits. There was Ed Hopper's New York, huge retrospective, one of the biggest ever, I think, for Hopper. There was an exhibit of Puerto Rican artists, their work after, like, related to Hurricane Maria and the aftermath of that tragedy. And then we had a smaller painting and sculpture, like the relationship between the two, and of course the Whitney's permanent collection pieces. So study 1, think aloud about a piece of art that you consider personally meaningful. And the instructions that we gave them was pretty much like, it's a few more sentences, but pretty much that. Find a meaningful piece of artwork, and then I want you to talk about it any way you want, take it any way you want, discuss whatever you want, and you have as much time as you want as well. Some visitors took like 2 minutes, others took longer, and we were very clear. We will stay with you as long as you want. If you want to talk for 2 hours, 2 hours might be pushing it. We might have said something, but if you want to talk for 30 minutes, we'll be there. Right? We'll keep recording. And then we did a second study, right? So the first study is like characterize that lived experience, the visitor's voice related to that meaningful art that they chose. The second was a 3-group experiment, essentially. What we wanted to see is, does engaging with art meaningfully, right? When you think out loud about it, does that do something to you cognitively that it actually impacts your creativity? All right, because you get engaged, you get more, you're maybe more open to certain experiences. You're more comfortable about sort of the idea of art. So that first group did that. The second group, we asked them to talk about technical things like, could you tell us the types of artworks that you saw? Sculptures, were there paintings? How long were you on in that gallery? How long were you in the exhibit? How big, what were the sizes of the works that you saw? It's an odd question, I know. It's like, what were the sizes? It's like about this big, 20 of those, a few these, right? It was weird. And then group 3, we recruited them upon entry. So all 3 groups did 2 creativity tasks. They did a metaphor generation task, right? We gave them a prompt. One was, great art is, and then they were to come up with a metaphor based on that one line. And then they also did a creativity, a collage making task. So we wanted to do a verbal, which is the metaphor, and then one that is closer to sort of visual arts, right? So I'm going to talk about study 1 results, and I'm going to hint to the study 2 results because we're still analyzing the data from study 2. So again, before I do this, it's like you're gonna see a lot of text, and we're gonna read through it together, all right? Because I really want to maintain that perspective of the participant, of those museum visitors. we recorded all the think-alouds, transcribed them. We went through a whole formal process of analyzing and coding of those think-alouds. If you want to know how we did it, come talk to me after, because it's the basically, we ended up reading, was it 70 visitors, hundreds of pages of transcripts. We went through them at least 5 times from beginning to end, at least, and then we had like verification processes after that, the initial process. So the results are these. These are the themes that came out. So across all the think-alouds, all the visitors, all the meaningful art that they chose, that's the think-aloud about. These are the 5 themes that we found were quite consistent. Like they talked about them. First, self and life history. I'm going to give examples of these. Others in the world, art techniques and materials, right? Obviously, that's like what you would expect to, if it's a sculpture, they want to talk about like the scale of it and how it was made. Search for meaning and the creation of an aesthetic narrative. I'll talk about that in a second. And artists in the creative process. Again, I said earlier about people want to know what the artist was thinking as they were creating whatever piece of artwork that they were living. So self and life history. This is by McDonald Wright, and it's a painting. I think it's about this big, purely abstract. If you see something there, that's okay. All right, some people do. And we'll read through this. I think any piece, so they're standing right in front of this painting, and then they're talking about it. I think any piece of art tells you in part how the artist sees the world at that moment. I think what it tells you is something elemental about yourself or about other people. They see it this way, I see it differently. The more you look at it, the more things you see. Like I see a rainbow in there now that I think originally I didn't see because we've been looking at it for 5 minutes and I'm like, oh, wait, where are all the other little things that I haven't seen? So I do definitely appreciate the ability to look at something for a prolonged period of time and see more. And I think humans are like that too, right? The more opportunity we have to connect with them, the more we see. Sometimes good and sometimes bad, both. So this is something that we will never get if we just gave them a survey, right? How, right? It's also something that if you approach a visitor, I've done studies in museums like for 15 years. If you walk up to a visitor and say, tell me what you're seeing. If you don't set it up, they're probably not going to tell you what they're seeing, right? It has to be a thoughtful process of like, all right, you recruit them, you explain what they're going to do, what you're asking them to do, and then you explain that it's a completely open context. Like they can think about, talk about whatever they want for as long as they want. And then things start coming out, right? And this is just the first one, but it gets really like interesting and really profound. So again, we're trying to characterize those experiences. This is a painting by McNeely. It is probably almost the height of, actually, it's like the size of this screen, just a little bit bigger, like add like a foot on on all sides. It's a very graphic painting, and the quote will actually tell you what it's about. So it says, the visitor says, when I first passed by the work, my first reaction actually was that it made me really uncomfortable. And I wasn't sure what the intention was meant to be of the really kind of aggressive depiction of, it was hard to tell even at first whether this was pleasure or pain. And I kind of walked around and I just moved away from it at first because I wasn't sure whether I liked that feeling. And then I was doing my second pass by. I was kind of curious, why did that give me such a strong reaction? And I didn't really inspect it carefully to try and think through. So I read the blurb, and I'm actually an OBGYN. I'm training to provide abortion care. And I don't see a lot of contents about getting abortions, providing abortions, really anything. And I think that was, for me, a really powerful example of how taking everything in context, the way that's presented, really opened up space for me to engage more with the art. And looking at it after reading the blurb, I feel like I was more comfortable to spend time in front of some of this really uncomfortable imagery and sort of feel more empathy and sort of also like hopelessness, but more in a human connected way, as opposed to an alienating way. right? So that's super fascinating of an approach, of a statement regarding this piece. This is by de Kooning. As an older person in my 60s now, I think that this art certainly forces you to think about kind of like life beyond where we are today. It certainly makes you think about things beyond the worldly. There's a spiritual nature to this, right? Something beyond what we are seeing here. And I think a lot about this abstract work, what was an attempt to broach the spiritual world and whatever that meant. What was beyond day-to-day shelter, eating, and clothing. The best art forces us to kind of question our existence and confront our emotions. So we think about like well-being. How many times during the day or during our week do we get to like hit these parts of our minds and our emotions and our ways of thinking, right? And we kind of like to see it that way, where art kind of forces you to open up in certain ways. And you know this, and because you're sitting in this room, right? I believe that, to kind of think maybe metaphysically, right? And historically as well. So this is a painting, sort of like, it's a painting or illustration. It's hard to describe this piece by Bailey. So if you look at it, those are human bodies, right? Connected, kind of like holding hands, but not shoulder to shoulder. Those are the two sides of it, left and right. And then in the middle is a cotton plant. And the visitor talks about kind of like the technical aspect of it mixed with like what they know about it historically. First of all, it looks like a blueprint, right? So it's technical. And I was drawn to it because I was aware, having been to the Smithsonian African American Museum, that I thought it was from a distance. I thought it was probably related to the slave ships. But then I noticed it was a cotton plant and it looks almost clinical and technical in its approach. But then when you look closely at it, there's actually quite a bit of technique involved. I think it was pretty meticulous and intentional in its technical approach. That these android figures are repetitive, and I've looked at them closely. They're sort of beautifully simple in their construction, but the botanical picture of the cotton plant, which for being such like the turn of a page of a textbook, says so much more than the typical text would say to you, especially juxtaposed with the slave ship shapes of the bodies. All right. So it's kind of weird that like the focus is on technique, even though the content of the piece is so heavy and loaded and like historically in every way you want to think of it. So that's art techniques and materials. Then we also have this idea of searching for meaning. So this is a piece by Tucker. It's an obvious emotion on this work in that the woman at the center is looking afraid and lost in a maze, like a cage almost. And a lot of other people in the painting are looking at her. And some of them are kind of wandering around aimlessly, creating the emotion of disconnection. Even though there's so many people in the painting and you can feel her pain. I don't know if she's pregnant. She's holding her belly like maybe she's afraid for her child. And then there's the angles and the bars and the stairs. Reminds me of going up, going down, going around like you're moving, but you're not going anywhere. So this theme is really one of the things that I guess we were surprised by it, at how consistent it was across most of the visitors. They're creating stories. Pretty much every piece of art that was chosen, they tried to create a story, right? They tried to create a story, I guess, in a way to try to understand what the piece was about. And then the last, I'm going to skip one here and then go straight to this. Artists in the creative process, and this is the set of images that I showed you earlier. Again, that's the artist as a child and her dad. And this is what the visitor said. I'm looking at someone's very personal experience with their family, and I think they don't say it directly in the description over there in the art. But they do kind of allude to the fact that her father, who committed suicide, just shy of the anniversary of Hurricane Maria. I think it means something to me. I think because I have an interesting relationship with my own father and this she talks about it. I guess in the description over there, and they kind of always like, they can't seem to say it. And then, so we retained that. We didn't clean it up. It's hard to read for me right now. I just think it means something to me, I think, because I have an interesting relationship with my own father, and this she talks about it, I guess in the description over there, they talk about how for her, this meant sort of trying to reconstruct a broken relationship after he had already been gone. And I think it's very on the nose art in a lot of ways, but I don't think that takes away from its meaning or what it can do to a person. And this is like as personal as it gets, obviously, like your childhood photos of her family, right? So if you think back to the mirror model, we do get a lot of this of like meaning making that is essentially trying to stand where the artist was at that moment that whatever it is was being created. And that's probably part of one of the themes that cut across all of the others. So obviously they're not all like, can't segregate one theme from the others. There are many instances where they were talking about all five, right? But that last bit, the artist in the creative process was really present in many of the think-alouds that we collected. So again, going back to this idea of searching for meaning and understanding, there's a paper that's going to come out that publishes these results in full. Like it's going to be a long paper, a lot of text, like going to be the longest paper I've ever written, actually. And my co-author, she's like, how are you now? I'm like, we're 10,000. No, and like, yes, there's no way we can't, we're gonna go to like 11, 12,000. I feel bad for the reviewers of that paper. So just quickly to study two, we're still analyzing the data. I was actually hoping to present some data today, but essentially what we're finding is this. The group one, the ones that did the think aloud about the art that they found meaningful, there seems to be something in their collages that it's leading them to have a more organized structure in how they put together the different bits to make a collage. So what we're finding is like it's organizational, the impact of those think alouds, like sort of meaningful processing. It's structural, organizational in the way they're composing the works. So for example, the one to the right, it's so interesting how like that person dominates the frame, but it's kind of like to the edge. It's almost uncomfortable. Like, why? What's the rest? Where's the rest of it? Right? So we have another paper for that too. So just let me know if you're interested in one section. That happens. I think that's it. So just like we're always looking at impact. And this is the type of impacts we need to measure in aesthetic experiences in museums. I'd like to thank my partner in crime is Ron Ivsevich from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and our research assistants helped collect the data. This research was funded by the Templeton Religion Trust, and then of course hosted by the Whitney Museum. It's just one of many studies that we're about to conduct, actually, and around sort of the same topic, with the same goal. Thank you.
Questions?
How much touching and encouraging does it take, or how natural is it to do these kinds of think alouds in the space? I mean, I know some people are just naturally fearless, but the space also kind of encourages a certain kind of quiet reticence. What are ways to kind of? It actually sounds like a really practical method for a lot of applications. Like, what are ways to kind of warm people up to people?
The consent process warms them up. What is this about? Well, we can't tell you exactly, but we'll give you a hint. But yeah, it varies, right? Some people are so verbal that you're like, wow, this is, as I'm listening to them talking, with the recordings, like, wow, they're gonna keep going, right? And then some, I can hear like a prompt saying, okay, tell me more about that. And then but it varies from some people are just kind of not comfortable to others are super comfortable. But I will say, Whitney Museum is always packed. It is not that quiet kind of museum. It rarely is. Even if you go there at 11 a.m. on a Wednesday, right? It's still going to be a lot of people. So you're not you'll be more inclined to talk out loud and make noise at the Whitney than other museums. So it's absolutely, the method is really fascinating, and we're gonna continue to use it.
I don't come from a research background, but I just wanted to share something I was thinking about as you were presenting was I used to work with some of these people at the art museum here in Philly. And we worked on a project that I think has since like become real, where for certain summer exhibitions, we intercepted families to respond to artwork and then collected kiddo feedback. We didn't need a lot of hand-holding to respond to the artwork, and then we were using their storytelling because they naturally are gifted storytellers and their interpretation of the work, and created labels. And as I was reading your survey responses, it's very similar to the kind of labels we ended up creating for exhibitions, where it was an artwork, there was still a curatorial like tombstone information, but then there was a children's interpretation and like going bananas answer. And I know why we wouldn't put a grown-up's answer. They're different, they're not as fun, and you might not laugh. But I, as a museum visitor, would still linger, I think, and read these kinds of survey results next to a work, next to tombstone information. And I don't think I'd ever really thought about that as something I might be curious about until this moment. I know there's some moments that we exhibit, like been in museums, and you might have seen something like that, but having worked in a family program setting, we were always like, more kid words, and like actually just in general, adult visitors' words would also be so
That's such
wonderful.
an interesting approach, though. I mean, it's kind of like a prime to actually think more deeply and differently,
100%.
right?
And people were like reading these kiddo descriptions and being like, well, I know that's a bird in an ocean, but the kid says it's a unicorn on a boat, and now they're looking at it longer as a
Right.
result of that kiddo's
Absolutely.
words. It's
I
amazing.
that's yeah, I love that idea. I wonder if some curators would find that disturbing though. Like, right, so you would have the other side.
That was a project that was in collaboration with the curator who
That's
was
awesome.
specifically game for that, and these folks could tell you more about how that project has evolved
That's
in
great.
the years.
Love it. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
I loved that you sort of explored self-relevancy in this study, and meaning making. I noticed they were separate categories, and in my experience, they are deeply intertwined. And so I just wondered if you could maybe, I know you haven't finished analyzing the data, but if you could speak a little bit both to your approach in thinking about those two, and maybe any initial findings you felt.
I think they are related. I might have oversimplified just the way it was presented, but definitely a lot of these are all interrelated.
Yeah.
So even with just the 5 themes, for example, some of the examples, artists and life history, and artists in the creative process, visitors were talking about their own lives as it related to the artist's life, right? Like in that one example. And then you had a lot more overlap, but when we start coding, we want to sort of pull the themes and separate them first, right? To see like what's common and what's not. And then obviously you would kind of, as you interpret it, kind of put them back together, so to speak, right? But yeah, I think it would be an approach that would separate them permanently would be very difficult and actually not right.
Yeah.
Because you're not retaining the visitor's voice at that point.
I was just gonna mention, when you're describing the think-aloud protocol and various audiences' responses to the artwork that they're gazing upon. Given that I've been a psychotherapist and trained in cognitive therapy, and then did 2 fellowships in different psychoanalytic institutes. I couldn't help but think about how in psychotherapy, quite often, regardless of how somebody might be, say at work or at home, when they come to the psychotherapeutic situation, it's really quite different. So some people may suddenly become very talkative, others may become quite withdrawn. And then that can vary depending upon the various kinds of topics going on throughout the year or years. There's a lot of resistance to various discussions, and so on and so forth. And so I think there's all kinds of reasons why people may have different types of responses, and as they're talking, might go through maybe different stages, of self-reflection, so thinking about themselves, or they're thinking about an object or something, whatever. I just thought I'd bring that up because there's a lot that I think could be really studied from this further, right? To me, it's just, because it's a great kind of technique, so much can be done.
It's also, they're sometimes shocked that you ask them to just talk about whatever.
Yeah.
Right, because it's, like I said, you're there and within that therapeutic context. Often it is open, right? Like, and you never get that in museums a lot. So often when you walk in or when you walk out, the exit surveys, you're given the form and everything. Even if you have the open-ended question at the end, it's always at the end, by the way, the open. So by the time they get there, they're so tired. We not put that first sometimes, right? But when we approach them and we say, oh, here's the record, we actually don't hold the recording device, we give it to them. And we're off to the side or behind, so they, most of the time as they're looking at the piece, they're not even seeing us. And they're almost shocked, like they stand there and they look, yeah, just go. Just go, like, yeah, whatever, where, start with whatever you wanna say. But once they get going, then I guess you kind of break the ice and then they just go. It's pretty fascinating.
And I also like this idea of emphasizing people to spend time in front of me, because nowadays, because the way the internet is, the way
Right.
Social media is, we just put photos and we don't gain any appreciation. for photos.
Absolutely.
It's just an instant like or dislike. And it's I think really quite deleterious to people's ability to really develop any kind of further appreciation for what they're doing. It makes it more difficult for the artists to really be able to get across what they try to do when people are not paying attention.
Absolutely, right. You gotta kind of engage for a certain amount of time to get to those bigger questions about the piece. 27.2 seconds is the average of amount of time that people spend looking at artworks. This was initially done by our colleagues Smith and Smith, my mentors, at the Met. This was in 2001. We replicated the study at Art Institute of Chicago in 2017. It was roughly 30 seconds. And the crazy thing is, within those 30 seconds, they read the label or they looked at the label. They also took what we termed an arty. Let's all do an arty. We're trying to be too cute. So they took a picture of the artwork, the label, processed everything, 30 seconds. Wow. Right. But then, there is a question of like, with all that, how can they come out of the museum thinking that they're impacted profoundly? Because sometimes they are. So the answer, Jeff Smith's answer, my colleague, is that it's the accumulation of 30 seconds or whatever, 15 here, 30 seconds there, 1 minute there. But 27.2 seconds was like the magic number. It's like, wow, right? And now is it shorter? I'm curious, actually. Is it even shorter now, given that you do have devices that if you're, looking at the painting, you can research everything about that painting in like 10 seconds. So is it going to change the fundamental way of looking at art?
I was wondering if you ever have repeat customers come in and do this survey and then come back and stare at the art movement.
They do. Sometimes we watch them. So they, we thank them. They got a gift card that they weren't expecting. All right. And then we see them go back. Some of the galleries at Whitney are kind of it's a big museum, but it's fairly small galleries, especially in the permanent collection. We see them come back and then look at the piece again, the one they thought out loud about for like 15 minutes. So then they just look, because they probably saw something as they were thinking out loud that they didn't see initially, and they wanted to explore it. Absolutely. But then we don't do it again with them. So.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm really curious, perhaps, I know you said you have more studies like this planned. Are you doing anything to kind of look at the effects, kind of extending on what he said, of having done this activity with you happens with them in terms of either their thinking developing or their interest in art or anything? Because I'm just wondering about how this is an accidental intervention in some ways.
Yeah, we are not yet, but I think that the second study does a bit more of that, where it's like more profound or longer term exposure, but nothing planned. But that's really a good point, right?
Because it's like you're accidentally doing something, and I'd be curious to know what happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a great question.
A
I think in response to your comments about the kiddo labels, I wonder, and it's interesting to think of this as, the accidental intervention and then the museum choosing to maybe codify these type of methods in a meet the visitor type label that I could foresee like a series of a certain type of label around the museum that is like meet the visitor, where the museum has done this type of method and then is using that on a regular basis. And I think going further with that, when I worked in a city history museum, in public history, we had a show called The Real Thing and Why It Matters, and it was a two-sided label. One was curatorial, one was a community member. But the person who'd been asked to give the community voice was curated for, ownership questions. Like, this is an object that either has something to do with your community, your history, or whatever. So like there was an infant's coffin, 19th century, and it was from the Black community in Philadelphia. And it was a time when infant mortality in general was high, but particularly high in the Black community. And the person commenting did run the Office of History Curriculum for African American Studies. But what was interesting and memorable, and this is probably like a dozen years ago now when I worked there, the museum actually folded after that. But he commented first on the craftsmanship, like the care taken to make the coffin. And I thought that was so touching. And then the curatorial label talked about this broader context and like provenance, or maybe about the church. I can't remember like what cemetery it was, but I just thought that I like that strategy a lot. And I think that it can get at community ownership, DAI, even notions of repatriation without actually giving an object back. You give it back by raising the voice of people who care about it. So.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Pablo. Really fascinating. I just want to reflect for a moment, Caitlin, on your comment. And